I still remember the first time I heard about Mount Volara. It was during one of those long, cold nights in the barracks, the kind of night where stories come alive, fueled by the flickering light of a single bulb and the camaraderie of men who have seen too much. I had been through my share of horrors, both as a Marine and in the years that followed, but there was something about the tale of Mount Volara that stuck with me, even after all these years. It wasn't just the story itself, but the way it was told, hushed tones, glances over shoulders, as if the very mention of the mountain could summon the darkness it held. They said the Sami people, indigenous to the region, believed the mountain to be a gateway to another realm, a place where the fabric of reality was worn thin. And that was precisely where the Soviet soldiers made their fatal mistake. The Winter War of 1939 was a brutal, bitter conflict, fought in the frozen wilderness where men were often as much at war with the elements as with each other. The Soviet Union, determined to secure strategic points along the Finnish border, set its sights on Mount Volara. The mountain was more than just a vantage point. It was a symbol of power, a place that offered a commanding view of the entire region. But to the Sami people, it was sacred ground, not to be disturbed. They warned the Soviet soldiers, pleaded with them even, but the warnings fell on deaf ears. The Soviets, confident in their numbers and firepower, dismissed the Sami's words as primitive superstition. The company of 100 Soviet soldiers, hardened by the harsh realities of war, began their march towards Mount Volara. They were led by a commander who saw the mountain as nothing more than an obstacle to be overcome, a piece of high ground that needed to be secured for the greater good of the Soviet cause. As they trudged through the deep snow, their breath fogging in the frigid air, the weight of their mission seemed to grow heavier with each step. The landscape was a desolate expanse of white, broken only by the dark, twisted shapes of trees that looked more like skeletons than anything living. There was no life here, no sound except for the crunch of boots on snow and the occasional barked order. I can only imagine the sense of unease that must have settled over them as they approached the base of Mount Volara. The mountain was a jagged, looming presence, its peak lost in a shroud of low-hanging clouds. The Sami guides, who had accompanied the soldiers as far as they dared, stopped at the edge of the forest and refused to go any further. They spoke in their own tongue, voices trembling with fear, and pointed towards the summit. The commander, a man of little patience, waved them off and ordered his men to continue. The guides watched in silence as the soldiers marched onwards, their forms slowly disappearing into the white wilderness. The first night on the mountain was a cold, silent one. The soldiers set up camp on a narrow ledge, their tents huddled together against the biting wind. The mountain's eerie silence weighed on them, broken only by the occasional creak of ice or the distant howl of the wind. Some of the men began to whisper among themselves, recalling the Sami's warnings, but these whispers were quickly silenced by their superiors. They were soldiers, after all, not children afraid of ghost stories. But as the night wore on, that silence became almost unbearable, a palpable force pressing down on them from all sides. As they settled in for the night, strange things began to happen. It started small. One of the soldiers noticed that the firewood seemed to burn faster than it should, the flames devouring the logs in minutes instead of hours. Another swore he saw something move in the shadows, just at the edge of the firelight. But when he looked closer, there was nothing there. A few of the men reported hearing faint whispers carried on the wind, voices speaking in a language they didn't understand. These incidents were brushed off as nerves, the natural result of exhaustion and a hostile environment. But deep down, they all felt it. The mountain was watching them. The next morning, as they prepared to continue their ascent, the Sami guides made one last attempt to dissuade the commander. They spoke of ancient spirits, of a curse that had claimed the lives of those who dared to climb too high. The commander, now irritated, dismissed them with a wave of his hand and ordered the men to move out. The Sami turned back, their faces etched with fear and sorrow, leaving the soldiers to face whatever awaited them on their own. As the company resumed its climb, the air grew colder, the wind sharper, as if the mountain itself was warning them to turn back. By the time they reached the upper slopes, the landscape had taken on a surreal quality. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Strange rock formations jutted out of the snow, their shapes defying explanation. The men began to feel the weight of the mountain's presence, an oppressive force that seemed to grow stronger the higher they climbed. The sky above was a dull leaden gray, and the sun, though barely visible, offered no warmth. The sense of unease that had been growing since they first set foot on the mountain now settled over them like a shroud. That night, as they made camp near the summit, the soldiers couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The wind howled around them, carrying with it strange sounds, whispers, footsteps, the creak of trees bending under an unseen weight. They huddled together, their breath visible in the frigid air, each man lost in his own thoughts. Some clutched at their weapons as if they could ward off whatever unseen force lurked in the darkness, but no weapon could protect them from what was coming. The mountain was patient, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the clouds, the soldiers prepared for what they hoped would be their final push to the summit. But something was different. The silence that had unnerved them before was now complete, absolute. Even the wind had died down, leaving the mountain in an unnatural stillness. The men exchanged uneasy glances, but there was no turning back now. With a final order from their commander, they began their ascent, unaware that they were marching towards their doom. Mount Volara loomed above them, its peak hidden in the clouds, a silent sentinel watching over their every move. The mountain had claimed many lives before, and it would not be denied again. As the soldiers disappeared into the mists that clung to the summit, the mountain waited, knowing that soon it would be bathed in blood once more. I can't help but imagine the soldiers, hardened men, each one already scared by the brutal winters and the unforgiving reality of war, trudging up that mountain. Their breaths would have been visible in the frigid air, hanging in front of their faces like clouds. Every step they took must have felt heavier than the last, each one driving them further into the unknown. The mountain's silent presence was like a weight on their shoulders, one they couldn't shake. It wasn't just the snow or the cold. There was something else, something deeper, more sinister. I've marched through many harsh places in my time, but even I can't fully understand the fear that must have gripped those men as they continued their ascent. The deeper they ventured into the mountain's labyrinth of icy cliffs and twisted trees, the more alien the world around them became. The trees, if you could even call them that, seemed to claw at the sky, their branches sharp and brittle, as though they'd been twisted into impossible shapes by some cruel hand. Rock formations jutted out of the snow like jagged teeth, their surfaces slick with ice, making every step treacherous. The soldiers, so used to the flatlands and the scattered forests of the Finnish front, must have felt like they had stepped into another world, a place where nature itself seemed hostile, as if the mountain wanted them to fail. As they climbed, the weather only worsened. The wind began to howl like a living thing, tearing at their clothing and freezing them to the bone. Snow, once soft and powdery, now whipped through the air like shards of glass, cutting into their exposed skin. And yet, despite the misery of the conditions, there was something else that gnawed at their minds, an unsettling feeling, a creeping sense of being watched. More than once, a soldier would glance over his shoulder, convinced there was someone, or something, following them. But there was never anything there, just the endless white landscape, broken only by the occasional dark shape of a tree or rock. At midday, the soldiers finally reached a plateau, a brief respite from the relentless climb. They set down their gear and gathered together for warmth, trying to eat a few bites of their cold rations. But the mood had shifted. The men who had started the day joking and laughing were now silent, their faces drawn and pale. Even the commanders, who had been so quick to dismiss the somni warnings, now seemed unnerved. They tried to rally the men, urging them to push on to the summit, but the words rang hollow. The mountain had gotten to them. its eerie silence, its unnatural shades, the sheer weight of the unknown. Among them were the Sami guides who had come along, though they had been increasingly reluctant as the altitude climbed. They had already gone further than they wanted to, and now, on that plateau, they'd made their final stand. They refused to go any higher, their faces ashen with fear. They warned the commander one last time, speaking in low, urgent tones about the spirits of the mountain, the curse that had claimed the lives of all who tried to conquer it. The commander, though clearly unsettled himself, would hear none of it. He ordered the men to continue without the guides, leaving them behind on the plateau as they marched towards the summit. The snowstorm hit shortly after they left the plateau, an almost biblical fury that descended upon them without warning. Visibility dropped to nothing, just a wall of white in every direction. The wind roared in their ears, making it impossible to hear each other, even when they shouted. Men lost sight of one another in the swirling snow, their figures swallowed up by the storm. Panic began to spread. The commander tried to keep control, barking orders into the void, but it was no use. They were blind, lost on a mountain that seemed to shift and change beneath their feet. I can only imagine the fear, the rising dread that comes when you know you're no longer in control, when nature, or perhaps something worse, has taken the reins. It wasn't just the weather that was turning against them. Equipment that had worked fine at the base of the mountain now malfunctioned. Compasses spun uselessly in circles, radios crackled with nothing but static. Even their watches seemed to be losing time, their hands slowing down or stopping altogether. There's something particularly unsettling about losing track of time in a place like that. It's as if the mountain was pulling them out of the world they knew and into some other place, a place where the rules of nature didn't apply. A place where time itself seemed to warp and bend, just like the twisted trees and jagged rocks around them. By nightfall, they were far from the summit, but too high up to turn back. They found a narrow ledge and set up camp, huddling together for warmth as the storm raged on. The wind screamed around them, but beneath the howl of the storm, some of the men swore they could hear something else. Footsteps in the snow, close by but unseen. Faint whispers carried on the wind, speaking in a language none of them understood. The men tried to dismiss it as their imagination, a trick of the storm, but deep down, they knew something was wrong. The mountain was watching them, and it didn't want them there. Then came the first disappearance. In the chaos of the storm, one of the soldiers, one of the best and most experienced, vanished without a trace. They had been standing watch, just a few meters from the rest of the group, when the snow swallowed them up. At first, the men thought he'd simply gotten lost in the storm, but when they searched for him, there was no sign of tracks leading away from the camp. It was as if the mountain had simply taken him, claimed him for itself. The mood in the camp darkened. Whatever bravado had remained was gone now, replaced by a deep, gnawing fear. In the dead of night, as the storm began to subside, the survivors huddled in their tents, weapons clutched tightly in their hands. Sleep didn't come easy. Every gust of wind, every creak of the ice, every whisper of the trees seemed like a threat. No one knew what was out there, but they all felt it. The presence lurking just beyond the edge of the firelight, watching, waiting. The Sami had warned them. The mountain had warned them. And yet here they were, alone in a place that wasn't meant for men, trapped on a ledge with no way forward and no way back. It was in the dead of that long, icy night when the first shots rang out. The stillness of the mountain, which had been so oppressive just hours before, was shattered by the staccato bursts of gunfire. Panic surged through the camp as soldiers scrambled for their weapons, their breath fogging the air as they shouted in confusion and fear. But the darkness was complete, and the storm had smothered the last of their campfires. They couldn't see what they were shooting at, only shadows that moved in the corner of their vision, if they saw anything at all. The soldiers fired blindly into the night, their gunfire illuminating the snow for brief, terrifying moments. In those flashes, they saw what they thought were figures, darting among the rocks and trees. Impossible, unnatural shapes that seemed to shift and twist with each burst of light. Then the darkness would close in again, leaving them with nothing but the echoes of their own frantic breaths and the sharp reports of their rifles. Some men screamed, others barked out orders that were lost in the chaos, but most were silent, their faces pale with fear. It didn't take long for the reality to set in. They were being hunted. The shapes in the darkness weren't just tricks of the mind. They were real, and they were getting closer. The soldiers could feel them now, a presence that pressed in on them from all sides, as if the very mountain had come alive and was reaching out to claim them. The commander, trying to rally his men, shouted for them to hold the line, but it was no use. The fear had taken hold, and men began to break, retreating into the darkness in the hopes of escaping whatever was out there. But in the confusion, many of them only ran deeper into the mountain's deadly grass. Meanwhile, the Finnish soldiers positioned a few miles away had been on high alert since they first heard the gunfire echoing across the wilderness. They had expected the sounds of battle, but not like this. This was different. The gunfire wasn't steady. It was erratic, desperate. And there were other sounds, too, strange, haunting noises that carried on the wind, unlike anything they had heard before. It wasn't the usual roar of artillery or the crack of rifles, but something else, something they couldn't quite place. The Finns, wary and experienced, knew better than to approach the mountain. They had heard the stories, the warnings from the Sami. They knew what kind of place Mount Volara was. So they waited, listening, their faces grim, knowing that whatever was happening up there, it was nothing good. Back on the mountain, the Soviet soldiers who hadn't fled were desperately trying to regroup. But every time they thought they had a handle on the situation, the darkness would close in again, and the terror would start all over. The whispers on the wind grew louder, more insistent, though still unintelligible, and the feeling of being watched intensified. Some men swore they felt icy hands brush against them in the dark, or heard footsteps crunching in the snow right behind them, only to turn and find nothing there. The commander, once so confident, was losing control, his voice cracking as he tried to maintain order. The storm, as fierce as it had been, suddenly died down, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. But the silence that followed was worse than the howling wind. The soldiers huddled together, their eyes darting around, searching for any sign of what had been attacking them. But there was nothing. The night stretched on, and with it, a growing sense of dread. They were trapped on that ledge, with nowhere to go and no way to defend themselves against something they couldn't see. The fear was palpable, almost as if the mountain itself was feeding off it, growing stronger with each passing moment. Then, as if to confirm their worst fears, one of the men standing watch let out a choked scream. The others turned just in time to see him being dragged into the shadows by something they couldn't fully make out. Something big and fast, with too many limbs moving in ways that defied logic. His scream cut off abruptly, leaving only the sickening sound of something being torn apart in the darkness. The soldiers opened fire again, but it was too late. Whatever had taken him was gone, leaving only a dark stain in the snow where he had been standing. By now, the men were in full panic. Some tried to retreat down the mountain, but the path was no longer there. The storm had buried it, or the mountain itself had swallowed it up. They were trapped, and they knew it. The remaining soldiers, now fewer in number, clustered together in the center of the camp, their backs to each other, rifles pointed outward, as if that would protect them from the nightmare that surrounded them. But deep down, they knew it was hopeless. The mountain had claimed them, and there was no escape. In the stillness that followed, the men could hear it, the soft crunch of snow underfoot, the low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all directions at once. They didn't know how many of those things were out there, or what they even were, but they knew they were closing in. The whispers on the wind grew louder, more distinct, and this time, some of the men thought they could almost understand the words, though they were in a language none of them recognized. It was as if the mountain itself was speaking to them, telling them that they didn't belong, that they had trespassed on sacred ground and now had to pay the price. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the assault stopped. The sounds, the shapes, the whispers, they all vanished, leaving only the silent, frozen night. The men, battered and broken, stood in a daze, unsure of what had just happened. It was as if the mountain had decided it had toyed with them enough, leaving the survivors to their fate. But the silence that followed was not a relief. It was a warning. They knew the worst was yet to come. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the survivors, what few remained, looked at each other with hollow eyes. The mountain had taken their comrades, their sanity, and now it seemed, their will to live. They knew they couldn't stay there, but the thought of going further up the mountain was just as terrifying as staying where they were. Yet they had no choice. They had to move, had to try to find a way down before whatever hunted them in the night came back. And so, with the cold dawn at their backs, they began their desperate descent, knowing full well that they might not survive another night on Mount Volara. As the first rays of dawn began to pierce through the cloud cover, casting a pale light over the snow-covered wilderness, the sounds of battle from Mount Volara finally ceased. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. The Finnish soldiers, who had been listening to the strange and terrifying noises all night, stood in tense silence, their eyes fixed on the distant peak. They had heard the echoes of gunfire, the screams, and the otherworldly sounds that defied explanation. Now, there was nothing. Just an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. The commander of the Finnish unit, a seasoned officer who had seen his share of horrors in the war, decided it was time to act. He couldn't ignore what had happened on that mountain. Orders were given, and a small scouting party was assembled. These were men chosen for their bravery and their ability to keep their wits about them under pressure. They knew the stories about Mount Volara, the warnings from the Sami, but they also knew that they had a duty to perform. They had to find out what had happened to the Soviet soldiers, and if possible, bring back any survivors. It was a grim task, but they steeled themselves for it. The ascent began slowly, the Finnish scouts carefully picking their way up the same path the Soviets had taken days before. The fresh snow had covered most of the tracks, but there were still signs of the struggle: broken branches, discarded equipment, and dark stains in the snow that could only be blood. As they climbed higher, the air grew colder, and the landscape became more treacherous. The mountain was silent now, but that silence was more unnerving than the sounds of battle. It was as if the mountain was watching them, waiting to see if they would share the same fate as the Soviets. When the scouting party reached the plateau where the Soviets had camped, they were met with a scene of devastation. The camp was in ruins, tents shredded, supplies scattered, and the snow stained with blood. But there were no bodies, at least not at first. The men spread out, searching the area for any sign of life, but what they found instead were more signs of something far worse. Blood trails led away from the camp, disappearing into the snow. Footprints, too, but not just those of the Soviet soldiers. There were others, strange, indistinct tracks that seemed to defy logic. It was as if something had stalked the Soviets in the night, something not entirely human. Finally, they found the first body. It was half buried in the snow, frozen in a twisted position, as if the man had died in the midst of some unimaginable terror. His eyes were wide open, his face contorted in a scream that had never left his lips. The Finnish soldiers exchanged uneasy glances as they continued their grim search, finding more bodies in similar states. Some were missing limbs, others had wounds that didn't make sense, deep gashes and punctures that looked like they had been made by claws or teeth. But there were no signs of an animal attack, no tracks that made sense. It was as if the mountain itself had risen up against them. The Sami guides, who had reluctantly accompanied the Finnish scouts to the base of the mountain, refused to go any further. They stood at the edge of the plateau, their faces pale with fear, muttering prayers to their gods. They had warned the Soviets, and now they warned the Finns. This mountain was cursed, a place where the spirits of the dead did not rest. The Finnish commander, though shaken by what they had found, knew he had to report back. They had seen enough. The mountain was no place for the living. He ordered the men to gather what they could from the wreckage: maps, weapons, anything that might offer clues, and prepare to leave. As the Finns made their way back down the mountain, the silence followed them, a heavy, suffocating presence. The Sami guides kept their distance, their eyes never leaving the peak, as if they expected it to reach out and grab them at any moment. The further they descended, the more the tension eased, but the memory of what they had seen remained. The soldiers who had climbed the mountain were changed men, their faces drawn and pale, their eyes haunted by what they had witnessed. It was a story they would carry with them for the rest of their lives, a story that would become legend. Back at their base, the Finnish commander made his report. He didn't know what to say, how to explain what they had seen. There were no words that could capture the horror of it, no way to describe the feeling of dread that had settled over them on that cursed mountain. He simply stated the facts as best he could. The Soviets had been attacked by something they couldn't explain. The Sami guides had warned them, and the warnings had been true. Mount Volara was a place of death, a place that should be avoided at all costs. Word of the incident spread quickly through the Finnish ranks, and soon no one wanted to go near the mountain. It became a no-man's land, a place where even the most battle-hardened soldiers refused to venture. The Soviets, too, avoided it, their own men speaking in hushed tones about the disaster that had befallen their comrades. The war continued, but Mount Volara remained untouched, its secrets buried under layers of snow and ice, hidden from the world. As the Finnish soldiers settled back into their routines, the memory of Mount Volara lingered. It was a story that would be passed down through the years, growing more terrifying with each retelling. The mountain stood as a reminder of the unknown, of the things that lurked just beyond the edge of understanding. It was a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred, where reality itself seemed to bend and twist. And as the years went by, those who had seen the mountain, who had survived its horrors, knew that some stories were best left untold. Even as the war raged on, the story of Mount Volara began to take on a life of its own, spreading quietly through both the Finnish and Soviet ranks. It wasn't long before the incident became something more than just a tale of soldiers lost to the elements. The strange events that had transpired on that mountain, the eerie silence that followed, and the inexplicable deaths all combined to create a mystery that refused to be buried under the snow. The soldiers who had been there, who had seen the aftermath, spoke in whispers, their words heavy with the weight of what they had witnessed. But for every story told, there were more questions than answers, and soon theories began to emerge. Some of the more pragmatic minds dismissed the whole affair as a tragic coincidence, a freak accident of nature. They speculated that the Soviet soldiers had been caught in a sudden avalanche, or perhaps had encountered a hidden crevasse that claimed their lives. But even these theories failed to explain the condition of the bodies, the strange wounds that didn't match any known animal or weapon, and the utter lack of tracks leading away from the site. It was as if the mountain itself had swallowed them whole, leaving behind only the remnants of their terror. And so, these rational explanations quickly gave way to more unsettling ideas. A popular theory among the soldiers, both Finnish and Soviet, was that the mountain was cursed, an ancient malevolent force that had been awakened by the intrusion of the soldiers. The Sami people, with their deep spiritual connection to the land, had always spoken of Mount Volara as a sacred place, a gateway to other realms. They believed that the spirits of their ancestors dwelled there, and that disturbing the mountain was a grave sin. The Sami had warned the Soviets, but their warnings had been ignored. Now, it seemed, the mountain had exacted its revenge. This idea took hold in the minds of the men, and soon, even the most hardened soldiers began to believe that something supernatural had occurred on that mountain. The official Soviet response, however, was far less fantastical. The incident was quietly swept under the rug, labeled as an unfortunate accident caused by extreme weather conditions. The deaths were attributed to exposure, frostbite, and the treacherous terrain. No mention was made of the strange wounds or the inexplicable circumstances surrounding the soldiers' demise. It was easier that way, easier to pretend that it had been nothing more than a natural disaster, easier to forget. But the soldiers who had been there, who had seen the bodies, knew better. They knew that what had happened on Mount Volara was anything but natural. As the years went by, the story of Mount Volara took on a life of its own. It became a ghost story, a cautionary tale told around campfires and in barracks, a warning to those who might be tempted to explore the unknown. The Sami people, who had always respected the mountain, continued to honor the spirits they believed lived there, offering prayers and sacrifices to appease whatever force resided on its peaks. To them, the mountain was a place of power, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, and they were content to leave it alone. But for others, the mystery was too tempting to resist. There were those who sought to understand what had happened, who believed that there must be a scientific explanation for the events on Mount Volara. Some suggested that the mountain might be a geological anomaly, a place where strange magnetic fields or underground gases could cause hallucinations or physical harm. Others speculated that there might be hidden dangers within the mountain, unknown animals, perhaps, or even remnants of ancient traps set by the Sami's ancestors. But no matter how many theories were proposed, none could fully explain the horror that had been unleashed on that cold, dark night. One theory, whispered among the more superstitious soldiers, was that the mountain was a doorway to another world, a place where the rules of nature didn't apply, where time and space were fluid, and where the spirits of the dead roamed freely. They believed that the Soviets had inadvertently opened this door, releasing something ancient and terrible. The strange sounds, the shifting shadows, the inexplicable deaths, all were signs that the soldiers had crossed a boundary they were never meant to cross. And once that door was opened, there was no way to close it again. I couldn't help but be drawn to this idea, as far-fetched as it seemed. I've seen my share of horrors in this world, both man-made and otherwise, but there was something about Mount Volara that defied explanation. The more I learned about the incident, the more I began to believe that there was something on that mountain, something that didn't belong in our world. Whether it was a curse, a spirit, or something else entirely, I couldn't say. But I knew one thing for certain. The soldiers who died there didn't die by any normal means. They were taken by something beyond our understanding, something that had been waiting for centuries for someone to make a mistake. The story of Mount Volara continued to haunt those who had been touched by it, even years after the war had ended. The Finnish soldiers who had witnessed the aftermath carried the memory with them, a dark stain on their souls that never quite faded. The Soviets, for their part, refused to speak of it, their silence only adding to the mystery. And as the years passed, the mountain itself remained untouched, its secrets buried beneath layers of snow and ice, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble upon them. In the end, the mystery of Mount Volara was never truly solved. It became one of those stories that linger on the edges of memory, half forgotten, but never fully gone. Theories and speculations continued to circulate, each more outlandish than the last, but the truth, if there ever was one, remained elusive. And maybe that's for the best. Some mysteries, I've learned, are better left unsolved. Some places are better left undisturbed. Mount Volara is one of those places, a place where the unknown reigns, where the past refuses to stay buried, and where the line between reality and nightmare is razor thin. Decades had passed since the horrors on Mount Volara, and the world had changed in ways both small and vast. The war had ended, borders had shifted, and the memory of the strange events on that remote mountain had faded into the shadows of history. But not everyone had forgotten. There were still those who remembered, who were drawn to the mystery like moths to a flame. And it was in the early 1980s, during a time of renewed curiosity about the unexplained, that a group of Soviet scientists decided to mount an expedition to the Cursed Mountain. They were driven by a desire to uncover the truth, to explain away the legends with cold, hard science. The expedition was carefully planned, with every detail scrutinized by the Soviet authorities. Officially, the mission was to study the mountain's unique geological formations and weather patterns, an opportunity to advance scientific knowledge and showcase Soviet prowess. But those in the know understood that the real objective was much more sinister. The Soviet leadership wanted to know what had happened to their soldiers all those years ago. They wanted to find out if there was any truth to the rumors of supernatural forces, or if it was simply a case of mass hysteria that had gone horribly wrong. The scientists chosen for the expedition were among the best in their fields. Geologists, meteorologists, biologists, each one highly trained and highly skeptical of the supernatural. They were accompanied by a small detachment of soldiers, ostensibly for protection, but in reality their presence was to ensure that the findings remained classified. The soldiers were also there to keep an eye on the scientists, to make sure that nothing dangerous or politically inconvenient came to light. The mission was a delicate one, and failure was not an option. As they approached Mount Volara, the scientists were confident, almost arrogant, in their belief that they could explain what had happened. They were men of reason, after all, and reason would prevail. The old stories were just that, stories, born out of fear and ignorance. They would find the truth buried beneath the snow, and in doing so, they would lay to rest the ghosts of the past. But as the mountain came into view, looming large and menacing against the gray sky, a chill settled over the group. It wasn't just the cold that made them shiver. It was something deeper, something primal. The mountain, even after all these years, still held an air of menace. The first few days of the expedition were uneventful. The scientists took samples, made notes, and marveled at the strange rock formations that littered the landscape. The soldiers, for their part, kept a wary eye on the surroundings, their rifles slung over their shoulders, ready for anything. The weather was harsh, but manageable, and the group made steady progress up the mountain. But as they climbed higher, the familiar sense of unease began to grow. Equipment that had functioned perfectly at the base of the mountain started to malfunction. Compasses spun uselessly, and radios crackled with static. The soldiers muttered among themselves, their faces tight with concern, but the scientists dismissed it as a temporary glitch, nothing more. As they neared the summit, the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, thinner, and the wind howled through the twisted trees with a ferocity that made conversation impossible. The scientists, now visibly unnerved, pressed on, driven by a mixture of curiosity and stubborn pride. They had come too far to turn back now. But the soldiers were less sure. They had heard the stories, the warnings from the locals who still refused to go near the mountain. And as they set up camp on a narrow ledge just below the summit, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The first night on the summit was quiet, too quiet. The wind had died down, leaving an unnatural stillness that pressed in on them from all sides. The scientists, exhausted from the climb, retired to their tents, leaving the soldiers to stand watch. But as the hours dragged on, the silence became oppressive, almost suffocating. The men strained to hear anything, a bird, an animal, even the sound of the wind. But there was nothing, just the heavy, ominous silence. And then, just before dawn, the first strange occurrence happened. One of the soldiers on watch saw something, a shadow, moving just beyond the edge of the camp. He called out, but there was no response. The shadow disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving the soldier shaken and unsure of what he had seen. The next morning, the scientists were informed of the incident, but they brushed it off as a trick of the light, or perhaps a figment of the soldiers' imagination. They had more important things to focus on, like the strange magnetic readings they were getting from the summit. Something was interfering with their instruments, something they couldn't explain. The more they probed, the stranger things became. Temperatures fluctuated wildly, from bone-chilling cold to sudden, inexplicable warmth. The ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate, almost imperceptibly, as if the mountain itself was alive. But the scientists refused to acknowledge what was happening, clinging to their rational explanations like a lifeline. That night, the true horror began. As darkness fell, the camp was enveloped in a thick fog that rolled in from nowhere, cutting visibility to zero. The soldiers, already on edge, tightened their grip on their rifles, their eyes darting nervously around the camp. The scientists, huddled in their tents, tried to ignore the growing sense of dread that had settled over them. But then came the sounds, soft at first, like whispers carried on the wind. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they filled the air, surrounding the camp in a cacophony of voices speaking in a language no one understood. The soldiers, now in a full-blown panic, fired their weapons into the fog, but their bullets found nothing. The scientists, driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, emerged from their tents to find the camp in chaos. The fog was so thick that they could barely see their own hands in front of their faces. The whispers had turned into guttural growls, echoing off the rocks and trees, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the fog lifted, leaving the camp in eerie silence. But the silence didn't last. As the scientists and soldiers tried to regroup, they realized that one of their own was missing. A soldier, one of the most experienced among them, had vanished without a trace. The next morning, the camp was a scene of panic and confusion. The scientists were at a loss, their instruments useless, their theories in shambles. The soldiers, terrified and exhausted, demanded to leave the mountain immediately. But the leader of the expedition, a man driven by a need for answers, refused to turn back. They had come this far, he argued, and they couldn't leave without finding out what was really happening. But as they prepared to continue their investigation, the mountain had other plans. The following night was worse than the last. The fog returned, thicker and more impenetrable than before. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if the mountain itself was trying to communicate something. The soldiers, now reduced to a state of near hysteria, fired wildly into the darkness, but it was no use. The mountain was playing with them, toying with their minds, driving them to the brink of madness. And then, just before dawn, the assault began. Shadows moved through the camp, too fast to be seen, too strong to be human. One by one, the soldiers fell, their screams cut short by the invisible force that tore through them. When the fog finally lifted, the camp was in ruins. The few remaining survivors, their minds shattered by what they had witnessed, fled down the mountain, leaving behind everything: equipment, findings, even their fallen comrades. The expedition was a failure, and the Soviet authorities wasted no time in burying the truth. The official report labeled the deaths as the result of a freak accident, a landslide, perhaps, or sudden exposure to toxic gases. But those who had been there knew better. They knew that Mount Volara was not a place for men, that whatever lived on that mountain was beyond their understanding. The survivors, both scientists and soldiers, never spoke of what they had seen. They returned to their lives, haunted by the memories of that cursed mountain, knowing that the truth would never be known. Mount Volara remained untouched, its secrets buried under layers of snow and ice, waiting for the next foolhardy soul to try and uncover them. But the mountain had made one thing clear. It was a place of death, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, and where those who trespassed would pay the ultimate price. Mount Volara remains etched in my memory, a dark silhouette against the fading light of history. Even now, years after the last doomed expedition, the mountain stands untouched, its secrets buried deep within its icy heart. I've often thought about what it would be like to return, to stand once more at the base of that cursed peak and look up at its jagged summit. But I know better. Some places are not meant to be understood, and some stories are best left untold. The legacy of Mount Volara is one of death and madness, a place where the boundary between reality and nightmare blurs, leaving only fear in its wake. I've spent many nights contemplating what really happened on that mountain. The soldiers, the scientists, even the Sami people, all were drawn into its web, their lives forever altered by something beyond their comprehension. Theories abound, as they always do. Some say it was the mountain itself, alive in a way we can't understand, defending itself against intruders. Others believe it was a gateway to another world, a place where the rules of our reality don't apply. I've heard whispers of ancient gods, spirits trapped in the earth, and forces older than time itself. But for all the speculation, the truth remains elusive, hidden in the shadows that cling to Mount Volara like a shroud. The few survivors of that last expedition, those who returned from the mountain with their minds intact, or as intact as they could be, never spoke of what they saw. They lived out their days in quiet obscurity, haunted by memories they could never fully grasp. I heard rumors that one of them, a scientist, ended his life just a few years after the expedition. Another disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only a cryptic note that spoke of shadows in the fog and whispers in the night. It seems that even in their return to the world of the living, they could never truly escape the mountain's grip. For the Sami people, Mount Volara remains a place of reverence and fear. They continue to honor the spirits they believe dwell there, offering prayers and sacrifices at the mountain's base, but they never climb its slopes. To them, the mountain is a gateway, a place where the souls of the dead pass into the next world. They have long accepted that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, that some forces are beyond human understanding. It is a wisdom born of centuries of living in harmony with the land, of respecting the boundaries between the known and the unknown. In the years that followed the last expedition, Mount Volara has become something of a ghost story, a tale told around campfires and in the dark corners of taverns. Soldiers speak of it in hushed tones, recounting the horrors their comrades faced, while scholars debate the nature of the mountain's power. But no one ventures there anymore. The mountain has claimed its place in the collective consciousness as a place of death, a place where the veil between worlds is thin and reality twists into something unrecognizable. And so it stands alone, a silent sentinel over the wilderness, its secrets locked away beneath the snow and ice. I've come to realize that the legacy of Mount Volara is not just the terror it inspires, but the questions it raises. What is it about that place that drives men to madness? Is it something in the earth, a geological anomaly, or is it something more, something ancient and malevolent, something that defies the very nature of our reality? I don't have the answers, and perhaps I never will. But I've learned to live with the uncertainty, to accept that some things are beyond our comprehension. The mountain exists, and that is enough. As I sit here, reflecting on all that has happened, I can't help but think of the soldiers who never returned, the scientists who sought answers only to find death, and the Sami who continue to respect the mountain's power. Their stories are intertwined with the mountains, threads in a tapestry of fear and fascination that spans generations. And I wonder if, in some way, they are still there, their spirits lingering in the fog that clings to the summit, their voices carried on the wind that howls through the trees. Perhaps they are part of the mountain now, bound to it by the forces that claim them. The legacy of Mount Volara is one of unanswered questions and unending fear, a place where the line between the living and the dead is blurred beyond recognition. It is a reminder that there are forces in this world that we cannot control, that some places are better left undisturbed. The mountain stands as a testament to the unknown, a monument to the power of nature, and to the things that lie beyond our understanding. And in the end, perhaps that is the only truth that matters, that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, and that the mountain will keep its secrets until the end of time. As I close this chapter of my life, I know that I will never return to Mount Volara. The fear it instills, the power it wields, is too great. But its legacy will remain with me, a dark shadow at the edge of my thoughts, a reminder of the thin line between reality and nightmare, and perhaps in the quiet moments, I will think of the mountain, of the stories it holds, and wonder if someday someone else will be foolish enough to try and uncover its secrets. But for now, the mountain stands alone, its icy peaks reaching into the sky, a place of death, a place of mystery, a place where the unknown reigns supreme.